Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most relatable divine mysteries, why the ancient Greeks literally worshipped hangovers. Picture this. You're stumbling through the marble streets of Athens at dawn, your head pounding like Zeus's own thunderbolt, wondering how a civilization that gave us democracy, philosophy, and geometry also gave us the world's first patron saint of feeling absolutely terrible after a night out. You're about to discover that the Greeks didn't just tolerate their hangovers, they made them holy. And honestly, you probably won't survive hearing about some of their cures without questioning every life choice you've ever made. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global community of night owls and history buffs. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported back to ancient Greece, around 800 BCE, when wine wasn't just a beverage, it was liquid divinity. The Greeks believed that wine was the gift of Dionysus, the god of ecstasy, fertility, and yes, the inevitable morning after regret. But this wasn't some casual weekend hobby god we're talking about. Dionysus was serious business, representing the thin line between civilization and chaos, between divine inspiration and complete disaster. You watch as Greek society transforms around this fermented grape juice, turning what could have been simple agriculture into a complex religious and social system. The cultivation of wine grapes became sacred work. You see Greek farmers treating their vineyards like temples, understanding that they weren't just growing fruit, they were nurturing the very essence of their god. The process of fermentation itself was considered magical, a transformation that only divine intervention could explain. How else could simple grape juice become something that could make you speak to the gods, compose epic poetry, or alternatively, wake up naked in a fountain with no memory of how you got there? Historians still argue whether Dionysus was originally a Greek god or imported from Thrace or Asia Minor. But what's undeniable is how completely he revolutionized Greek culture. You witness entire city-states organizing their calendars around wine festivals, their economies around wine trade, and their social hierarchies around who could afford the good stuff versus who had to settle for the ancient equivalent of box wine, which, spoiler alert, was probably just regular wine stored in clay jars that looked suspiciously like boxes. The Greeks developed an entire vocabulary around wine consumption that makes modern sommelier talk look amateur. You learn words like symposiarch, the person who controlled the wine-to-water ratio at drinking parties, and crater, the large bowl where wine was mixed with water, because apparently even the Greeks knew that drinking straight wine was a recipe for disaster. They understood that wine wasn't just about getting drunk. It was about reaching specific states of consciousness, each with its own social and religious significance. You discover that the Greeks classified different types of wine-induced experiences. There was the pleasant buzz that made conversation flow like honey, the inspired madness that allowed poets to channel the muses, and yes, the complete obliteration that left you praying to whatever god would listen to make the spinning stop. Each level had its place in Greek society, from the philosophical discussions that required just enough wine to loosen tongues, but not enough to lose coherence, to the ecstatic rituals where complete loss of self was the entire point. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Greeks didn't see hangovers as punishment for excess. They saw them as part of the divine experience, a necessary shadow cast by Dionysus himself. You realize that in Greek thinking, you couldn't have the transcendent joy of wine without also accepting the crushing weight of its aftermath. It was a package deal, and complaining about hangovers was like complaining about having to sleep after staying awake. It missed the entire point of the cycle. The morning after a night with Dionysus wasn't seen as a failure of self-control or a medical problem to be solved. It was a religious experience in its own right, a time when the god was still present in your body, working his way out through your pores and your pounding temples. You were literally hosting divinity, even if that divinity felt like it was trying to escape through your skull with a small hammer. You find yourself standing at the edge of ancient Athens as the sun sets on the day of Dionysia, the city's most important wine festival. The air thrums with anticipation and the distant sound of flutes, and you can already smell the unmistakable mixture of wine, roasted meat, and human sweat that characterized these legendary celebrations. You're about to witness how the Greeks turned drinking into a religious art form. And trust me, their idea of moderate consumption would make a modern fraternity brother weep with admiration. The Great Dionysia wasn't just a festival, it was a citywide explosion of controlled chaos that lasted for days. You watch as ordinary citizens transform into something between religious devotees and party animals, their usual social constraints dissolving like honey in wine. The festival began with a procession carrying a statue of Dionysus through the streets. But this wasn't your typical religious parade. People danced, sang, and drank as they walked, creating a moving river of intoxication that swept through the city like a beautiful, terrible flood. You observe the fascinating psychology at work here. The Greeks understood something that modern society often forgets: that humans need controlled outlets for their wildest impulses. The Dionysia provided exactly that: a sanctioned time and place where social rules could be bent, where slaves could mock their masters, where women could speak freely, and where everyone could drink until the world spun sideways. And somehow, that was not only acceptable, but holy. The wine flowed from giant craters positioned throughout the city, each one a focal point for spontaneous communities of revelers. You notice how the Greeks had perfected the art of communal drinking. This wasn't solitary drowning of sorrows, but collective ascension to altered states. Strangers became friends over shared cups. Philosophical debates erupted between wine-soaked intellectuals, and poets received divine inspiration that they probably wouldn't remember clearly the next morning, but would spend weeks trying to recapture in verse. But here's what made Greek wine festivals truly revolutionary. They weren't just about getting drunk. They were about achieving specific altered states that the Greeks believed brought them closer to divine truth. You watch as experienced celebrants pace themselves, knowing exactly how much wine would bring them to the sweet spot of Dionysian enlightenment without crossing into the realm of complete obliteration. Though plenty of people crossed that line anyway, and that was fine too. Historians still argue whether the original Dionysian festivals were as wild as later Roman adaptations, but archaeological evidence suggests the Greeks knew how to party. You see evidence of wine cups designed to be impossible to set down until empty, forcing continuous consumption, and wall paintings depicting celebration scenes that would make modern party photographers blush. The Greeks even had professional symposiarchs, drinking party masters, who controlled the wine-to-water ratio and guided the evening's progression from civilized conversation to ecstatic revelation. You discover that different cities had different approaches to their wine festivals. Athenians preferred intellectual drinking games and philosophical discussions, while Spartans, because of course they did, turned wine consumption into a form of military training, testing young men's ability to maintain their composure while intoxicated. The island of Chios, famous for producing the ancient world's most expensive wine, held festivals where social hierarchy temporarily inverted, with servants ordering their masters around, and everyone pretending this was totally normal. The morning after these festivals, you witness entire cities waking up with collective hangovers of epic proportions. But instead of shame or regret, there was a strange sense of accomplishment. The Greeks had successfully communed with their god, pushed the boundaries of human experience, and lived to tell the tale. The hangover was proof that they had been somewhere special, had touched something divine, had participated in the great mystery of Dionysus. You notice that the Greeks developed entire support systems around these collective hangovers. Public fountains ran with water mixed with honey and herbs. Vendors sold special morning-after foods designed to settle queasy stomachs, and the city's physicians made house calls to treat the worst cases of divine aftermath. It was like the world's first hangover infrastructure, a civilization-wide acknowledgement that if you were going to worship a god of wine, you'd better be prepared for the consequences. The genius of the Greek approach was that they made hangovers communal rather than isolating. Instead of suffering alone in shame, Greeks suffered together in solidarity, comparing notes on their divine experiences and laughing about the ridiculous things they'd done while under the influence of their god. You realize that this collective approach to alcohol's aftermath created a healthier relationship with both the pleasures and the consequences of drinking. You recline on a couch in a wealthy Athenian home, your head propped on embroidered cushions as servants prepare for what the Greeks called a symposium, literally drinking together. Though you quickly realize this is less like modern dinner parties and more like a carefully orchestrated journey into controlled intoxication with a side of intellectual discourse. The room glows with oil lamps, and you can smell the mixture of wine, perfumed oils, and the faint smokiness that clings to everything in the ancient world, preparing yourself for an evening that will redefine your understanding of both friendship and fermentation. The symposium represented the pinnacle of Greek drinking culture, where wine wasn't just consumed, but carefully calibrated to achieve specific social and intellectual effects. You watch as the symposiarch, the evening's designated drinking master, determines the wine-to-water ratio for the evening, a decision that will shape everything from the depth of philosophical discussion to the likelihood of anyone remembering their own name by dawn. This wasn't casual drinking. It was precision intoxication, an art form that required years of practice to master. You observe the fascinating social dynamics at play. Only adult male citizens were allowed to participate in symposia, creating an exclusive club where Athens' elite could bond over shared cups and shared hangovers. The seating arrangement followed strict protocols, with honored guests reclining on the finest couches, while everyone else arranged themselves according to social hierarchy. But here's the beautiful contradiction. As the wine flowed, these rigid social structures began to dissolve, creating temporary democracies of intoxication where ideas mattered more than bloodlines. The evening follows a predictable yet enchanting rhythm. You start with light wines mixed with plenty of water, accompanying civilized conversation about politics, philosophy, or the latest theatrical productions. As the wine ratio increases, the talk becomes more personal, more daring, more profound. You witness grown men discussing their deepest fears, their greatest ambitions, their theories about the nature of existence, conversations that would never happen in the sober light of day, but flow naturally in the golden glow of Dionysian influence. Historians still argue whether the philosophical breakthroughs attributed to symposia actually occurred during these wine-soaked evenings, or were simply remembered and refined later. But the cultural impact is undeniable. You realize that some of the greatest works of Greek philosophy, poetry, and political theory emerged from these drinking sessions, as if wine acted as a solvent for the rigid thinking that normally constrained brilliant minds. The games and entertainment at symposia were legendary. You participate in katabos, a drinking game where participants flicked wine dregs at targets while making toasts to their lovers, essentially ancient beer pong with romantic overtones and much more expensive wine. There were riddle contests, poetry competitions, and philosophical debates where the quality of your argument was directly proportional to your blood alcohol content. The Greeks had turned drinking into performance art. But the most fascinating aspect of symposium culture was how it institutionalized hangovers as a social experience. You discover that the morning after a symposium was almost as important as the evening itself. Participants would gather again, often at the same house, to compare notes on their revelations, laugh about their embarrassing moments, and try to piece together the fragments of brilliance they'd achieved while intoxicated. These morning after sessions, called epidemia, were where the real intellectual work happened, taking the wine-fueled insights and crafting them into coherent thoughts. The Greeks developed an entire etiquette around symposium hangovers. You learn about the proper way to greet fellow symposiasts who were clearly suffering from divine aftermath with gentle humor and offers of honey water, never with judgment or mockery. There were even specific foods considered appropriate for hangover recovery. Bread soaked in wine hair of the dog taken literally, raw eggs mixed with vinegar, and various herbal concoctions that promised to ease the transition from divine inspiration back to mortal consciousness. You notice how symposium culture created lasting bonds between participants. Men who had shared wine, conversation, and collective hangovers became lifelong friends, political allies, and intellectual collaborators. The vulnerability of being intoxicated together, the shared experience of touching the divine and paying the price, created trust that no amount of sober interaction could match. You were literally drinking partners in the deepest sense of the term. The symposium also served as a training ground for young men learning to handle both wine and social responsibility. You watch as older participants guide younger ones through the evening's progression, teaching them the difference between productive intoxication and destructive excess. It was education through controlled experience, learning to navigate the territory between sobriety and oblivion with the wisdom of those who had already mapped that dangerous terrain. You find yourself in the ancient medical school of Kos, observing as Hippocrates himself examines a patient suffering from what he delicately calls wine sickness. Though you quickly realize that Greek physicians approached hangovers with the same systematic rigor they applied to any other medical condition, complete with detailed theories about bodily humors, divine intervention, and treatments that range from surprisingly sensible to absolutely terrifying. The morning light streams through the windows as you prepare to learn how the fathers of Western medicine tackled humanity's oldest self-inflicted ailment. Greek physicians understood wine's effects on the human body with remarkable sophistication, developing theories that wouldn't be entirely out of place in a modern medical textbook if you ignored the parts about angry gods and imbalanced humors. You watch as Hippocrates explains to his students that wine affects different people differently based on their natural constitution, their age, the season, and their relationship with Dionysus. He's not entirely wrong, even if his explanations involve concepts like hot and cold temperaments rather than blood alcohol content and liver enzymes. The theory of the four humors dominated Greek medical thinking about alcohol. You learn that wine was considered naturally hot and moist, meaning it increased the body's natural heat and moisture levels. A hangover in this framework occurred when wine threw the humors out of balance, creating an excess of heat that manifested as headaches, and an excess of moisture that caused nausea and general misery. The cure, naturally, involved restoring balance through opposing forces, cold, dry treatments that would counteract wine's effects. You observe Greek physicians prescribing treatments that make surprising sense even today. They recommended drinking plenty of water to restore hydration, eating bland foods to settle the stomach, and gentle exercise to help the body process the alcohol. But they also prescribed some remedies that would make modern doctors raise their eyebrows. Raw owl eggs mixed with wine, hair of the dog meats protein shake, wearing amulets made from the bones of fish that had died of natural causes, and applying heated stones to specific pressure points while chanting prayers to Asclepius, the god of healing. Historians still argue whether Greek physicians actually believed in the divine aspects of their treatments, or simply included them to satisfy patients' expectations. But the medical observations themselves were remarkably accurate. You read ancient texts describing the progression of intoxication with clinical precision, the initial euphoria, the loss of coordination, the impaired judgment, and finally, the inevitable collapse into unconsciousness. These doctors were clearly familiar with alcohol's effects from extensive personal observation. The Greeks also developed the first systematic approach to understanding alcohol tolerance. You discover that physicians recognized that regular wine drinkers could consume larger quantities without ill effect, while occasional drinkers would succumb to smaller amounts. They even understood that drinking wine with food reduced its intoxicating effects, though they explained this in terms of food, absorbing the wine's heat rather than slowing alcohol absorption into the bloodstream. You're fascinated to learn that Greek physicians categorized different types of hangovers based on their symptoms and recommended specific treatments accordingly. A hot hangover with headaches and fever required cooling treatments like cucumber juice and cold baths, while a cold hangover with nausea and chills needed warming remedies like ginger tea and heated stones. They even had different treatments for hangovers caused by different types of wine. Apparently, the ancients were sophisticated enough to recognize that cheap wine caused worse hangovers than expensive wine, though they attributed this to the quality of the grape's relationship with Dionysus rather than the presence of congeners and impurities. The most advanced Greek physicians understood that hangovers weren't just physical ailments, but also affected the mind and spirit. You observe treatments that addressed what we might now call psychological symptoms, depression, anxiety, and the general sense of existential dread that accompanies severe hangovers. Their solutions involved a combination of physical remedies, social support, and spiritual practices, essentially early holistic medicine that treated the whole person rather than just the symptoms. You discover that Greek physicians also served as early addiction counselors, recognizing that some people couldn't control their wine consumption and needed medical intervention. They developed the first systematic approaches to what we might now call alcohol abuse, using a combination of physical treatments, dietary changes, and psychological support. The cure often involved gradual reduction rather than complete abstinence, recognizing that wine was too central to Greek culture to eliminate entirely. The Greeks even understood the concept of alcohol poisoning, though they described it in terms of wine fever or Dionysian madness. You read accounts of physicians treating cases where people had consumed so much wine that they fell into dangerous unconsciousness, using techniques like induced vomiting, cold water immersion, and forced exercise to prevent what they called wine death. Their success rate was probably higher than you'd expect, thanks to their systematic approach and willingness to intervene aggressively when necessary. You stand before a massive marble statue of Dionysus and immediately realize this isn't the jolly, bearded wine god you might have expected. Instead, you're facing a figure who embodies the beautiful terror of intoxication itself, young and androgynous, with wild hair crowned in ivy, holding a cup that seems to promise both ecstasy and destruction in equal measure. This god doesn't just rule over wine and hangovers. He presides over the fundamental human tension between civilization and chaos, between the desire to transcend our limitations and the inevitable price we pay for that transcendence. And you're about to discover why the Greeks needed such a complex deity to explain something as simple as drinking too much. Dionysus represented everything the Greeks feared and craved about losing control. You explore the myths surrounding his birth, twice born from Zeus's thigh, after his mother Semele was killed by Zeus's lightning, and realize this origin story perfectly captures the god's dual nature. He was both divine and mortal, both creative and destructive, both the inspiration for humanity's greatest art and the cause of its most spectacular disasters. The Greeks understood that wine, like its patron god, was never simple or safe. You discover that Dionysus wasn't just about pleasant intoxication. He was the god of madness, of the wild feminine energy that civilized society tried to suppress, of the primal forces that lurked beneath the veneer of Greek rationality. His followers, the Maenads, were women who abandoned their domestic roles to run wild in the mountains, tearing apart animals with their bare hands and drinking their blood mixed with wine. This wasn't recreational drinking. This was spiritual possession that could turn gentle housewives into terrifying forces of nature. The Greeks told stories about Dionysus that read like cautionary tales about alcohol's power. You learn about King Pentheus, who refused to honor the god and was torn apart by his own mother and sisters in their wine-fueled frenzy, not recognizing him in their madness. Or the daughters of King Minyas, who rejected Dionysian worship and were driven insane, ultimately killing and eating one of their own children. These weren't just myths, they were warnings about what happened when you tried to ignore or suppress the forces that Dionysus represented. But Dionysus was also the god of theater, of artistic inspiration, of the creative madness that produced humanity's greatest works. You realize that the Greeks understood something profound about the relationship between intoxication and creativity. The same force that could destroy rational thought could also liberate the imagination, break down the barriers between conscious and unconscious mind, and allow artists to access truths that sobriety kept hidden. Every hangover was a reminder that touching the divine always came with a price. Historians still argue whether Dionysus was originally a Greek god or adopted from other cultures, but his integration into Greek religion reveals something essential about how the Greeks viewed alcohol's role in human life. You see that he wasn't worshipped despite his dangerous aspects, but because of them. The Greeks didn't want a safe, predictable wine god. They wanted a deity who embodied the full spectrum of wine's effects, from inspiration to destruction, from communion to isolation, from divine revelation to mortal suffering. You explore the seasonal aspects of Dionysian worship, discovering that his festivals followed the agricultural cycle of grape cultivation. Spring brought celebrations of new growth and potential. Summer honored the ripening fruit. Autumn celebrated the harvest and the first taste of new wine. And winter involved somber reflections on the god's death and rebirth. Each season required different approaches to wine consumption, different relationships with intoxication, different ways of honoring both the pleasures and the perils of Dionysus's gifts. The god's iconography reveals the Greeks' sophisticated understanding of alcohol's effects. You notice that Dionysus is often depicted with a thyrsus, a staff topped with a pine cone, and wrapped in ivy, which symbolized both fertility and intoxication. The pine cone represented the pineal gland, which the Greeks believed was the seat of consciousness, while the ivy never died, symbolizing the eternal cycle of intoxication and recovery, of spiritual death and rebirth that every serious drinker experienced. You discover that Dionysus had different aspects for different types of wine experiences. Dionysus Eleutherios was the liberator who freed people from social constraints. Dionysus Menamenos was the mad god who brought dangerous possession. And Dionysus Iacchos was the mystic deity who revealed hidden truths through intoxication. The Greeks understood that wine wasn't a single experience, but a spectrum of altered states, each requiring its own relationship with the divine. The temples dedicated to Dionysus weren't just places of worship, but centers for understanding the full implications of wine consumption. You observe priests who served as early counselors, helping people navigate the territory between sacred intoxication and destructive excess. They offered guidance on how to approach wine as a spiritual practice rather than mere indulgence, how to honor the god without being destroyed by him, how to find the narrow path between sobriety and oblivion that led to genuine insight rather than mere escape. You find yourself participating in the most sacred and terrifying of Dionysian rituals, the Anthesteria, the festival of flowers and wine that marked the opening of the new wine season, and immediately realize that this isn't just religious celebration, but a carefully orchestrated journey into collective altered consciousness, where hangovers aren't just inevitable, but actually sacred, a necessary part of the spiritual experience that transforms ordinary suffering into divine communion. The air thrums with anticipation and the scent of fresh wine as you prepare to understand how the Greeks turned the morning after into a religious experience. The first day of Anthesteria, called Pythagogia, or opening of the jars, was when the new wine was first tasted after months of fermentation. You watch as priests ceremonially break the seals on massive clay jars, releasing the intoxicating aroma of wine that has been touched by Dionysus himself. But this isn't casual tasting. It's a ritual communion where the first sip connects you directly to the god. And the Greeks understood that receiving divine gifts always came with divine consequences. You participate in the second day, chose, or pitchers, where every citizen receives their own pitcher of wine and drinks in sacred silence. The silence isn't just ceremonial, it's practical, because speaking while drinking was believed to interfere with the god's ability to communicate through the wine. You realize that the Greeks had ritualized the experience of getting increasingly intoxicated, turning what could be mere drunkenness into a structured spiritual practice, where every stage of inebriation had religious significance. The third day, Chaitra or pots, was when the hangovers were consecrated. You wake up with the rest of Athens, your head pounding with what the Greeks called the god's weight, and discover that instead of hiding in shame, the entire city was celebrating their collective suffering as proof of divine contact. Special ceremonies were held where people shared their hangover experiences, comparing the intensity of their headaches as a measure of how deeply they had communed with Dionysus. You observe priests leading morning after rituals designed to honor the hangover as a sacred state. Incense was burned to purify the air for sensitive noses. Honey water was blessed and distributed to soothe queasy stomachs, and special prayers were offered thanking Dionysus for the privilege of suffering in his name. The Greeks had turned the most unpleasant aspect of drinking into a religious practice, transforming individual misery into collective spiritual experience. Historians still argue whether these hangover rituals were serious religious practices or elaborate cultural coping mechanisms, but the archaeological evidence suggests the Greeks took their sacred suffering seriously. You discover temple inscriptions recording the intensity of hangovers as offerings to the god, wine cups designed to be impossible to empty without complete intoxication, and even special coins minted to commemorate particularly legendary collective hangovers that supposedly brought divine revelations to entire cities. The mystery cults of Dionysus took sacred hangovers even further, developing elaborate initiation rituals where neophytes were required to drink specific amounts of wine while undergoing various physical and psychological challenges. You learn about the lesser mysteries, where initiates drank wine mixed with unknown herbs while walking through underground tunnels, and the greater mysteries, where they consumed pure wine while fasting for days, creating hangover experiences so intense they were considered spiritual death and rebirth. You discover that different cities had different approaches to sacred hangovers. Athenian priests taught that hangovers were messages from Dionysus that required interpretation, like dreams or omens, while Spartan religious practices treated hangovers as tests of endurance that separated the spiritually weak from the strong. The island of Delos held ceremonies where the intensity of your hangover determined your religious rank for the coming year, creating a hierarchy of sacred suffering. The Greeks developed elaborate theories about the spiritual significance of different hangover symptoms. You learn that headaches were signs that Dionysus was trying to communicate directly with your mind. Nausea meant the god was purging spiritual impurities from your body, and sensitivity to light indicated that you were still partially existing in the divine realm, where earthly illumination was too harsh for transcendent consciousness. You participate in group hangover healing rituals that combined practical medicine with spiritual practice. Communities would gather in temples dedicated to Dionysus, where priests led collective recovery sessions involving chanted prayers, herbal remedies, and shared storytelling about the previous night's revelations. These weren't just support groups, they were religious services where people processed their spiritual experiences and integrated their divine encounters into daily life. Most fascinating aspect of sacred hangover culture was how it transformed shame into pride. You observe Greeks comparing their hangovers like war wounds, wearing their suffering as badges of honor that proved their dedication to the god. The worse your hangover, the more deeply you had touched the divine, the more worthy you were of respect from your community. They had completely inverted the normal relationship between excess and regret, turning self-inflicted suffering into spiritual achievement. Morning after rituals weren't just about celebrating hangovers, but about learning from them. You discover that Greek priests served as early therapists, helping people understand what their wine-induced experiences revealed about their true selves, their hidden desires, their spiritual needs. The hangover was seen as a period of vulnerable honesty when the barriers between conscious and unconscious mind were thin, making it an ideal time for self-examination and spiritual growth. Wake up in ancient Athens and immediately reach for the cup of watered wine that serves as your morning beverage, realizing that for the Greeks, wine wasn't just for special occasions, but was literally woven into every aspect of daily existence, from breakfast to bedtime prayers, from children's meals to funeral rites, creating a society where low-level intoxication was the normal state of consciousness, and complete sobriety was actually considered slightly suspicious, if not downright unhealthy. Your day begins with wine and will end with wine, and everything in between will be influenced by the gentle buzz of Dionysus's presence in your bloodstream. The Greeks didn't drink water the way we do today. It was often contaminated and dangerous. So wine mixed with water became the primary beverage for all ages and social classes. You observe families starting their day with a mixture of 1 part wine to 3 parts water, just enough to provide mild antiseptic properties and a gentle mood enhancement without causing obvious intoxication. Children drank heavily watered wine from weaning, gradually increasing the wine ratio as they aged, creating a population that was essentially microdosing alcohol from birth to death. you discover that Greek wine consumption followed elaborate social rules that would make modern etiquette experts weep with admiration. The ratio of wine to water wasn't just about intoxication, it was about social signaling, with different mixtures appropriate for different situations. Morning wine was heavily watered, afternoon wine was moderately mixed, and evening wine could be served stronger. But drinking unmixed wine was considered barbaric, behavior worthy of barbarians and people who obviously didn't understand civilization. The workplace culture of ancient Greece revolved around wine in ways that would give modern HR departments collective heart attacks. You observe craftsmen taking regular wine breaks, not to get drunk, but to maintain the steady level of relaxation that Greeks believed was essential for good work. Potters shaped clay with wine-steady hands. Sculptors carved marble with wine-enhanced patience. And writers composed literature with wine-inspired creativity. The Greeks had figured out how to use alcohol as a productivity tool rather than a productivity killer. You notice that different professions had different relationships with wine. Philosophers drank to enhance their thinking. Artists drank to unlock their creativity. Politicians drank to ease the tension of public speaking. And soldiers drank to build courage before battle and camaraderie afterward. But everyone drank something, and the quality and quantity of your wine consumption was a direct reflection of your social status and economic power. Historians still argue whether Greeks actually consumed as much wine as the historical records suggest. But the archaeological evidence is overwhelming. Wine cups are among the most common artifacts found in Greek ruins. Wine storage facilities dominate residential architecture, and wine-related imagery appears on everything from coins to tombstones. You realize that trying to understand Greek culture without wine would be like trying to understand modern American culture without automobiles or cell phones. The economics of wine shaped Greek society in fundamental ways. You discover that wine was currency, payment for services, diplomatic gifts, and religious offerings, all rolled into one. A man's worth was often measured by the quality of wine he could afford to serve guests, and families saved for years to afford the good stuff for important occasions. Wine merchants were among the wealthiest citizens, and wine-producing regions held significant political power in the Greek world. You observe how wine consumption varied by gender, age, and social status in ways that reveal the complex hierarchies of Greek society. Free adult men had the greatest access to high-quality wine and the most freedom to drink it, while women, slaves, and children were restricted to lower-quality wines and smaller quantities. But even these restrictions weren't about prohibition. They were about maintaining social order in a society where everyone drank, but not everyone drank equally. The Greeks developed sophisticated systems for managing the social consequences of ubiquitous wine consumption. You learn about neighborhood wine-watching groups that monitored each other's consumption, family interventions for relatives who couldn't handle their daily wine, and citywide policies that regulated wine quality and availability. They understood that a society built around alcohol needed strong social institutions to prevent the kind of chaos that could destroy civilization. Religious wine consumption was separate from social wine consumption, with different rules, different qualities, and different purposes. You participate in daily prayers that involve wine offerings to household gods, weekly ceremonies that require specific wine rituals, and seasonal festivals that transform ordinary wine into sacred substances. The Greeks had created a complex system where wine was simultaneously mundane and divine, ordinary and extraordinary, depending on the context and intention behind its consumption. You discover that Greek medicine recommended wine for almost every ailment, from digestive problems to depression to insomnia. Physicians prescribed specific types of wine for specific conditions, mixed with various herbs, and consumed at particular times of day. Wine wasn't just medicine, it was preventive care, daily maintenance for physical and mental health that kept people functioning in a world that was often harsh and unpredictable. The evening ritual of wine consumption was when the day's accumulated stress was processed and released. You observe families gathering around craters filled with wine mixed to the perfect ratio for relaxation without intoxication, sharing stories, discussing problems, and planning for tomorrow. These weren't drinking sessions. They were family therapy sessions where wine served as both social lubricant and emotional release valve, helping people navigate the complexities of human relationships. You awaken in your ancient Greek bed with the familiar weight of divine displeasure pressing against your skull, and immediately understand that this isn't just the result of drinking too much wine. It's a message from Dionysus himself, a divine communication system where the severity of your suffering correlates directly with either the god's approval of your devotion or his anger at your disrespect, depending on how you conducted yourself during the previous evening's communion with his sacred gift. The Greeks had developed an entire theology around hangovers that transformed personal misery into cosmic significance, and you're about to learn how they turned the morning after into a form of divine revelation. The Greek understanding of hangovers as punishment wasn't about moral judgment in the Christian sense. It was about maintaining proper relationships with the gods. You discover that Dionysus was believed to personally monitor every wine consumption session, noting not just how much you drank, but how you drank it, with whom you shared it, and what intentions you brought to the experience. A hangover wasn't random physical consequence, but targeted divine feedback about your spiritual performance during intoxication. You learn about the different types of divine punishment that hangovers could represent. A mild headache with clear thinking might indicate that Dionysus was pleased with your restraint and wisdom, sending just enough discomfort to remind you of his presence without seriously impeding your daily activities. A crushing, nauseating hangover that left you unable to function was interpreted as serious divine displeasure. Perhaps you had been disrespectful to fellow drinkers, wasted good wine, or failed to honor the god properly during your consumption. The Greeks developed elaborate diagnostic systems for interpreting hangover symptoms as divine messages. You observe priests who specialized in wine reading, analyzing hangovers the way other religious officials read animal entrails or bird flights. The location of your headache indicated which aspect of Dionysus was communicating. The intensity revealed the urgency of his message, and the duration showed how long you needed to contemplate whatever lesson the god was trying to teach you. You discover that some hangovers were considered divine rewards rather than punishments. The Greeks believed that certain types of wine-induced suffering indicated that you had achieved particularly deep communion with Dionysus, and the pain was simply the inevitable result of mortal consciousness trying to process divine experience. These sacred hangovers were worn like badges of honor, proof that you had transcended ordinary human limitations and touched something genuinely divine. Historians still argue whether Greeks actually believed these theological explanations or used them as cultural frameworks for managing alcohol-related guilt, but the religious practices surrounding hangover interpretation were elaborate and widespread. You find temple records documenting hangover consultations, with priests offering guidance on what specific symptoms meant and how to respond appropriately to divine messages received through wine-induced suffering. The concept of hangover as punishment created interesting social dynamics around drinking behavior. You observe how Greeks monitored each other's morning after conditions, not just out of concern for physical health, but as indicators of spiritual standing within the community. Someone who regularly experienced severe hangovers was either deeply devoted to Dionysus and deserving of respect, or repeatedly offending the god and deserving of intervention, determining which required careful observation of their behavior and character. Learn about the ritual responses to different types of divine punishment delivered through hangovers. Mild divine displeasure required simple offerings, a cup of wine poured on the ground with appropriate prayers, or sharing wine with someone less fortunate as a gesture of gratitude and humility. Severe hangover punishment demanded more elaborate responses: fasting, temple visits, special prayers, or even temporary abstinence from wine, until the god's favor could be restored through proper devotion. The Greeks also developed the concept of collective hangover punishment, where entire communities suffered together as divine commentary on their shared behavior. You witness citywide hangovers following major festivals, interpreted as either collective divine approval of the community's devotion or divine warning about moral or spiritual failures that needed addressing. These mass hangovers became opportunities for community self-examination and social reform. You discover that hangover punishment wasn't always individual. Sometimes Dionysus was believed to punish people for the wine-related sins of their family members, friends, or community leaders. This created complex webs of responsibility, where your mourning after suffering might reflect not your own behavior, but your association with others who had offended the god. Greek families developed elaborate protocols for managing collective hangover guilt and determining who needed to make amends to restore divine favor. The theological framework of divine hangover punishment also provided psychological benefits that the Greeks clearly understood. You observe how transforming physical discomfort into spiritual significance helped people process the guilt and regret that naturally accompanied excessive drinking. Instead of simply feeling bad about poor choices, Greeks could reframe their suffering as divine communication, opportunity for growth, and evidence of their connection to the sacred realm. You learn about the seasonal aspects of hangover punishment, with the Greeks believing that Dionysus was more or less tolerant of excess, depending on the time of year, the phase of the moon, and various astronomical considerations. Spring hangovers were generally interpreted as gentle divine encouragement to embrace renewal and growth, while winter hangovers were seen as stern warnings about the dangers of seeking escape from natural cycles through artificial means. The most sophisticated Greek thinkers understood that the hangover as punishment framework served multiple functions. It provided meaning for inevitable suffering, created social controls around drinking behavior, offered opportunities for spiritual growth through difficulty, and maintained the sense that human actions had cosmic significance. You realize that by making hangovers divine rather than merely medical, the Greeks had created a system that honored both the pleasures and the perils of wine consumption, while keeping individuals connected to larger spiritual and social realities. You stumble to the local pharmakeia, the ancient Greek equivalent of a pharmacy, crossed with a temple, clutching your throbbing head, and desperately seeking relief from what feels like Zeus himself is playing drums inside your skull, only to discover that Greek hangover remedies range from surprisingly effective treatments that wouldn't be out of place in a modern emergency room to absolutely bonkers concoctions that make you wonder if the cure might actually be worse than the divine punishment you're trying to escape. The elderly pharmacist eyes your condition with the practiced gaze of someone who has seen countless pilgrims of Dionysus seeking salvation from their own devotion. The Greeks approached hangover treatment with the same systematic methodology they applied to all medicine, developing elaborate theories about what caused the suffering and how to counteract it through opposing forces. You learn that their fundamental principle was restoring balance to the four humors that wine had disrupted, which sounds sophisticated until you realize this often involved treatments like drinking your own urine mixed with honey, wearing raw fish tied to your forehead, or consuming a breakfast of pickled sheep's eyes with vinegar, remedies that make modern hangover cures look positively civilized. You discover that Greek physicians classified hangovers into different categories, requiring different treatments. Hot hangovers characterized by fever, headache, and irritability needed cooling remedies like cucumber juice, cold baths, and applications of wet clay to the temples. Cold hangovers marked by nausea, chills, and depression required warming treatments, including ginger tea, heated stones placed on the stomach, and vigorous exercise to restore the body's natural heat. Mixed hangovers, the worst kind, demanded complex combination therapies that could take days to complete. The most popular Greek hangover remedy was something called kykeon, a drink made from barley, water, herbs, and sometimes honey that was supposed to restore strength and clarity to wine-addled minds. You sample this ancient sports drink and discover it's actually not terrible. The barley provides carbohydrates for energy. The herbs offer various medicinal properties, and the honey helps with blood sugar stabilization. The Greeks might not have understood biochemistry, but they had accidentally created something that addresses several aspects of hangover physiology. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of Greek hangover remedies, but many of their treatments align surprisingly well with modern medical understanding. You learn that they recommended drinking lots of water, still the foundation of hangover treatment, eating bland foods like bread and porridge, gentle on upset stomachs, taking warm baths, which improve circulation and help with muscle aches, and getting moderate exercise, which can help process alcohol metabolites. They just explained these treatments in terms of humoral balance rather than liver function and dehydration. You explore the more exotic remedies that wealthy Greeks could afford, including imported herbs from Egypt, precious stones believed to absorb wine's harmful effects, and elaborate ritual baths involving multiple types of scented oils. The rich could hire professional hangover attendants who specialized in morning after care, providing everything from herbal remedies to gentle massage to philosophical counseling, designed to help process whatever insights had been gained during the previous night's communion with Dionysus. The Greeks also developed the world's first hangover prevention strategies, understanding that avoiding severe morning after suffering was preferable to treating it. You learn about pre-drinking rituals involving specific foods: bread soaked in wine, raw eggs, various oils that were supposed to coat the stomach and slow wine absorption. They even had hangover insurance policies, agreements with friends to monitor your consumption and intervene before you crossed the line from divine communion into divine punishment. You discover that different Greek cities had different hangover specialties based on their local resources and medical traditions. Athenian physicians preferred intellectual approaches, prescribing reading, conversation, and gentle mental exercises to restore clarity to wine-fogged minds. Spartan remedies focused on physical treatments, cold water, exercise, and endurance challenges that treated hangovers as weakness to be overcome through discipline. Island communities developed treatments using seawater, marine plants, and fish-based remedies. The religious aspects of Greek hangover treatment were as important as the medical ones. You participate in morning after rituals at temples of Asclepius, the god of healing, where priests offered prayers for relief while administering herbal remedies and therapeutic treatments. These weren't just medical consultations. They were spiritual counseling sessions where hangovers were interpreted as divine messages, requiring both physical healing and spiritual response. You learn about the social aspects of Greek hangover treatment, discovering that collective recovery was often more effective than individual suffering. Families and friends would gather to share remedies, compare symptoms, and provide mutual support during the vulnerable period of divine aftermath. These hangover support groups served multiple functions. They provided practical medical care, emotional support, and social accountability for future drinking decisions. The Greeks even developed hangover remedies specifically for different professions and social roles. You discover that athletes had access to special treatments designed to restore physical performance quickly, while philosophers received remedies that prioritized mental clarity over physical comfort. Politicians needed treatments that would allow them to function publicly without showing obvious signs of divine communion, while artists often preferred remedies that preserved wine-induced creativity while reducing physical discomfort. You observe the economics of Greek hangover treatment, noting that remedy merchants were among the most prosperous traders in wine-drinking cities. They sold everything from simple herbal teas to complex multi-ingredient potions, often with elaborate marketing claims about their effectiveness and divine approval. The hangover cure industry was apparently as lucrative in ancient Greece as it is today, proving that human nature hasn't changed much over the millennia. The most sophisticated Greek hangover treatments addressed not just physical symptoms, but the psychological and spiritual aspects of wine-induced suffering. You learn about therapies that helped people process whatever revelations or embarrassments had occurred during intoxication, integrate divine insights into daily life, and maintain healthy relationships with both wine and the God who ruled over it. These holistic approaches recognized that hangovers weren't just medical problems, but opportunities for growth, learning, and spiritual development. You find yourself observing the Athenian Agora on the morning after a major wine festival, watching as the entire social fabric of the city rearranges itself around the collective hangover that has transformed ordinary citizens into shambling examples of divine communion, and immediately realize that Greek society had developed elaborate systems for managing the social consequences of a culture where getting drunk wasn't just acceptable, but religiously mandated, creating complex webs of accountability, forgiveness, and strategic amnesia that kept civilization functioning despite regular episodes of alcohol-induced chaos. The morning light reveals a community learning to navigate the delicate balance between divine ecstasy and social responsibility. The Greeks understood that wine-induced behavior could destroy relationships, ruin reputations, and undermine social order. So they developed sophisticated protocols for managing the aftermath of intoxication. You observe the practice of symposium amnesty, a cultural agreement that most things said or done while under Dionysus's influence would be forgiven and forgotten, provided they didn't cross certain clearly defined lines involving violence, property damage, or serious insults to the gods. This wasn't just social politeness, it was practical necessity in a culture where everyone regularly lost control. You discover that Greek law made important distinctions between crimes committed while sober and those committed while intoxicated. Wine-influenced offenses were often punished less severely, based on the understanding that the person wasn't entirely responsible for actions taken while hosting divinity in their body. However, this leniency came with conditions. Repeat offenders lost their wine excuse privileges, and certain crimes were considered so serious that intoxication made them worse rather than better, suggesting the person had deliberately misused their divine communion. The social hierarchy of Greek wine culture created fascinating dynamics around hangover etiquette. You observe elaborate protocols governing how people of different social ranks should interact during the vulnerable period of divine aftermath. Lower status individuals were expected to show extra deference to their hungover superiors, while those of higher rank had obligations to be more patient and forgiving toward their suffering subordinates. Everyone understood that hangovers were the great equalizer, divine punishment that could humble anyone regardless of their earthly power. You learn about the institution of wine sponsors, established citizens who took responsibility for monitoring and controlling the drinking behavior of younger or less experienced community members. This wasn't just moral supervision, but practical risk management, since the actions of intoxicated individuals could reflect poorly on their families, neighborhoods, and social groups. Wine sponsors served as early intervention specialists, stepping in when someone's relationship with Dionysus threatened to become destructive rather than divine. Historians still argue about the actual crime rates in Greek wine culture, but the legal codes and social practices suggest they had developed effective systems for managing alcohol-related problems. You discover evidence of specialized courts for wine-related disputes, professional mediators who specialized in hangover period conflict resolution, and community service programs that used collective hangovers as opportunities for social bonding and mutual aid rather than individual suffering. The economic consequences of Greek drinking culture were both positive and negative, creating entire industries around wine production, distribution, and consumption, while also generating costs related to productivity loss, property damage, and medical treatment. You observe how Greek communities balanced these trade-offs, recognizing that wine culture provided significant social, religious, and economic benefits that justified the associated costs and risks, provided they were managed intelligently. You discover that Greek marriage customs included elaborate negotiations about wine consumption rights and responsibilities, with couples establishing agreements about how much each partner could drink, when, and under what circumstances. These weren't just personal preferences, but legal contracts that protected family interests and social standing. Divorce cases often involved disputes about wine-related behavior, and marriage counselors regularly dealt with problems stemming from incompatible approaches to divine communion. The Greeks developed sophisticated systems for managing workplace consequences of wine culture, understanding that universal hangover mornings required flexible scheduling and modified expectations. You observe businesses that operated on wine time, informal schedules that accounted for the natural rhythms of drinking and recovery that governed Greek life. Employers learned to plan important activities around wine festivals and developed backup systems for times when key personnel were suffering from divine aftermath. You learn about the political consequences of Greek wine culture, discovering that many important decisions were made during symposia when wine loosened tongues and revealed true intentions, but also that mourning after regret could destabilize alliances and agreements made under Dionysian influence. Greek political culture developed elaborate protocols for determining which wine-influenced commitments were binding and which could be renegotiated once divine clarity returned. The military implications of Greek drinking culture were particularly complex, since wine was essential for building soldier solidarity and courage, but could also undermine discipline and effectiveness. You observe how Greek armies managed the balance between necessary morale building and operational readiness, developing systems for controlled group intoxication that strengthened unit cohesion without compromising military capabilities. Battle-tested strategies included wine rationing, rotation schedules, and designated sobriety officers. You discover that Greek educational systems incorporated wine culture into their curricula, teaching young people not just how to drink, but how to manage the social consequences of drinking within their communities. This education included practical skills like reading social cues during intoxication, understanding consent and responsibility under the influence, managing personal relationships affected by wine consumption, and maintaining reputation and honor while participating in divine communion. The Greeks also developed elaborate systems for managing the intergenerational transmission of wine culture, ensuring that each generation learned from the mistakes and successes of their predecessors. You observe mentorship relationships where older Greeks guided younger ones through the complexities of adult wine consumption, family traditions that preserved wisdom about healthy drinking practices, and community institutions that provided support for those who struggled to maintain balance in their relationship with Dionysus. The most sophisticated aspect of Greek social management of wine culture was their understanding that collective problems required collective solutions. You witness community-wide interventions for neighborhoods where wine consumption had become destructive, citywide policies for managing festival-related chaos, and regional cooperation for addressing wine-related issues that crossed political boundaries. They had learned that a society built around alcohol required strong social institutions and active community engagement to remain healthy and functional. You stand in the ruins of ancient Dionysiac temples scattered across the Mediterranean, their broken columns and weathered altars testament to a religious movement that fundamentally shaped Western civilization's relationship with alcohol, consciousness, and the eternal human struggle between order and chaos. And you begin to understand how Greek wine culture didn't just disappear when the empire fell, but evolved, adapted, and spread through countless cultural transformations that continue to influence how we think about drinking, celebration, spirituality, and the complex dance between pleasure and responsibility that defines human existence. The echoes of ancient symposia still resonate in every toast, every wine tasting, every moment when alcohol transforms strangers into friends and ordinary evenings into memorable experiences. The Romans inherited Greek wine culture, but transformed it into something more organized, more imperial, more concerned with power than with spiritual communion. You observe how Dionysian festivals became bacchanalian orgies that eventually scandalized even the famously tolerant Romans, leading to legal restrictions and cultural backlash that drove wine worship underground while preserving its essential elements in more socially acceptable forms. The god of wine had learned to wear different masks for different audiences, adapting to survive cultural changes while maintaining his essential nature. You trace the fascinating evolution of Dionysian worship through early Christianity, where wine became central to religious practice through entirely different theological frameworks. The Greeks had worshipped wine as divine substance. Christians transformed it into symbol of divine sacrifice, maintaining the sacred nature of alcohol while completely changing its spiritual significance. You realize that every communion service, every blessing of wine, every religious celebration involving alcohol carries DNA from ancient Greek wine culture, though few participants recognize their connection to Dionysus. The medieval period saw Greek wine wisdom preserved in monastery cultures, where monks became Europe's primary winemakers and wine scholars, maintaining technical knowledge about viticulture and consumption, while embedding it within Christian spiritual frameworks. You discover how monasteries served as repositories for ancient knowledge about wine's effects on consciousness, community, and spiritual practice, translating Greek understanding into Christian language while preserving essential insights about alcohol's role in human experience. Historians still argue about the direct connections between ancient Greek wine culture and modern drinking traditions, but the patterns are unmistakable when you know what to look for. You observe how contemporary wine culture preserves Greek concepts like terroir, the connection between place and wine quality, symposium-style social drinking, the use of alcohol for creative inspiration, and even the integration of hangovers into social bonding experiences. The forms have changed, but the fundamental dynamics remain remarkably consistent. You discover that Renaissance humanists consciously revived Greek wine culture as part of their broader project of recovering classical knowledge, studying ancient texts about symposia, experimenting with historical wine recipes, and attempting to recreate the intellectual and social benefits that Greeks had achieved through controlled intoxication. These scholarly drinking clubs influenced European academic culture, creating traditions of faculty wine hours, graduate student gatherings, and intellectual societies that combined alcohol with serious discourse. The Enlightenment brought scientific approaches to understanding alcohol's effects, but many of the insights simply confirmed what Greek physicians and philosophers had observed centuries earlier. You learn how modern research on alcohol's impact on creativity, social bonding, stress relief, and psychological well-being validates ancient Greek understanding, while providing biochemical explanations for phenomena they had explained through divine intervention. The mechanisms had been discovered, but the essential experiences remained unchanged. You explore how Greek wine culture influenced the development of modern therapeutic communities, from 18th century drinking clubs that served social and psychological functions to contemporary wine therapy, social drinking programs, and even certain approaches to addiction treatment that emphasize community support and spiritual dimensions of alcohol problems. The Greeks had understood that drinking was fundamentally social and spiritual rather than merely physiological, and modern treatments often rediscover these insights. The American colonial period saw explicit attempts to recreate Greek symposium culture, with founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson studying classical wine traditions and attempting to establish American wine culture based on ancient Greek models. You observe how early American drinking traditions incorporated Greek ideas about wine's role in democratic discourse, social equality, and civic participation, though these ideals often conflicted with practical realities of frontier life and religious constraints. You discover that contemporary wine industry practices preserve many elements of ancient Greek wine culture, from the emphasis on terroir and seasonal celebrations to the social rituals surrounding wine tasting and the integration of wine into fine dining experiences. Modern wine marketing often unconsciously echoes Greek themes about wine's connection to creativity, spirituality, and transcendent experience, suggesting that ancient insights about wine's appeal continue to resonate with contemporary consumers. The psychological and sociological research on alcohol consumption continues to validate Greek observations about wine's effects on human behavior and social relationships. You learn how modern studies of alcohol's impact on creativity, social bonding, stress relief, and spiritual experience often rediscover insights that Greek philosophers and physicians had articulated thousands of years earlier, confirming that human nature and alcohol's effects on it have remained remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. You realize that perhaps the most enduring legacy of Greek wine culture is the framework it provided for thinking about alcohol as something more than mere intoxication, as a tool for spiritual exploration, social connection, artistic inspiration, and personal transformation that that requires wisdom, respect, and community support to use safely and beneficially. Every time someone raises a glass in genuine celebration, shares wine to build friendship, or uses alcohol to enhance rather than escape experience, they're participating in traditions that trace back to ancient Greek symposia and Dionysian festivals. The modern craft cocktail movement, wine appreciation culture, and even responsible drinking education all preserve elements of Greek wisdom about alcohol consumption as skilled practice rather than mere consumption, requiring knowledge, restraint, appropriate context, and community support. You observe how contemporary culture continues to grapple with the same fundamental questions that occupied Greek philosophers. How much is too much? What's the difference between enhancement and escape? How do we maintain the benefits of alcohol while minimizing its dangers? How do we honor both pleasure and responsibility? You find yourself back in the present moment, your head still resting on your pillow as the ancient Greek voices fade into the gentle hum of your fan, but carrying with you the profound realization that every hangover you've ever experienced connects you to an unbroken chain of human consciousness stretching back thousands of years, where mourning after suffering has served as both punishment and teacher, both individual trial and collective ritual, both warning and initiation into the complex relationship between transcendence and consequence that defines not just drinking culture, but the human condition itself. The weight of this historical connection settles over you like a warm blanket, transforming your understanding of humanity's most persistent self-inflicted mystery. You realize that the Greeks weren't just creating elaborate mythologies to explain their hangovers. They were developing sophisticated frameworks for understanding the fundamental human drive to alter consciousness, to transcend ordinary limitations, to touch something divine, or at least different from everyday experience, and then to integrate those experiences back into normal life through the inevitable process of return, recovery, and reflection that every hangover represents. Every civilization has had to solve this same puzzle: how to honor both the desire for transcendence and the requirements of daily responsibility. The eternal cycle that the Greeks recognized continues to play out in every culture, every generation, every individual who discovers alcohol's power to transform experience, and then learns to navigate the morning after consequences. You observe how contemporary society still struggles with the same questions that occupied ancient symposiarchs. What's the difference between use and abuse? How do we maintain the social and creative benefits of alcohol while minimizing its destructive potential? How do we teach wisdom about substances that can bring both insight and disaster? You discover that hangovers serve the same psychological and social functions today that they did in ancient Greece. They provide natural limits to excess, create opportunities for reflection and self-examination, generate empathy and community bonding through shared suffering, and maintain the sense that actions have consequences even when those actions feel divinely inspired. The hangover is nature's built-in reality check, ensuring that transcendence comes with accountability. Historians still argue about whether ancient Greeks actually experienced hangovers differently than modern people. But the cultural frameworks they developed for understanding and managing alcohol's aftermath remain remarkably relevant. You realize that contemporary approaches to drinking, from harm reduction programs to social drinking guidelines to addiction treatment, often rediscover insights that Greek philosophers and physicians articulated thousands of years ago, confirming that human nature and alcohol's effects on it remain fundamentally unchanged. The seasonal aspects of Greek wine culture also persist in modern life, with different times of year calling for different relationships with alcohol and different approaches to celebration and reflection. You observe how contemporary culture maintains rhythms of indulgence and restraint, celebration and recovery, social drinking, and personal reflection that echo ancient patterns while adapting to modern contexts and constraints. You contemplate how the Greek understanding of hangovers as divine communication might actually contain psychological wisdom that transcends religious belief. The idea that our morning after experiences reflect not just our physical condition, but our spiritual and emotional state, our relationship with community, our approach to pleasure and responsibility, our success or failure in maintaining balance between opposing forces that shape human experience. The community aspects of Greek hangover culture remain perhaps the most relevant legacy for contemporary society, where alcohol problems are often treated as individual medical issues rather than social phenomena requiring collective response. You recognize how the Greek emphasis on shared responsibility, mutual support, and community accountability for drinking behavior offers models for healthier approaches to alcohol that honor both personal freedom and social responsibility. As you drift toward sleep, you understand that every hangover is both ending and beginning, the conclusion of one cycle of exploration and excess, and the start of another period of integration and preparation for whatever comes next. The Greeks knew that this cycle would repeat as long as humans sought transcendence through substances, and their wisdom lay not in trying to break the cycle, but in learning to navigate it with grace, wisdom, and community support. The gentle rhythm of your breathing matches the eternal rhythm of intoxication and recovery, celebration and reflection, transcendence and return that has characterized human experience since the first person discovered fermentation and wondered what would happen if they drank the result. You carry with you the understanding that hangovers aren't just punishment or medical symptom, but part of a larger human story about the costs and benefits of seeking something beyond ordinary consciousness. Your eyelids grow heavy as you realize that tomorrow morning, whether you wake up refreshed or suffering, you'll be participating in the same ancient dance that connected Greek philosophers to their gods, medieval monks to their spiritual practice, and countless generations of humans to each other through the shared experience of pleasure sought and consequences accepted. The fan hums softly in the background, like the distant echo of ancient symposia where friends gathered to drink think, and learn together about the mysteries of consciousness and community. The last thing you remember thinking is how remarkable it is that something as simple as fermented grape juice could carry so much history, wisdom, and human meaning across thousands of years, connecting you not just to ancient Greeks, but to everyone who has ever raised a cup in celebration, suffered through the morning after, and wondered what it all means in the grand scheme of human experience. Sleep takes you gently, your dreams filled with marble columns, wine-dark seas, and the eternal conversation between pleasure and wisdom that every hangover represents. In the morning, you'll wake with new appreciation for humanity's most persistent and universal self-inflicted teacher, understanding that your own relationship with alcohol, whether you drink or not, connects you to this vast historical conversation about consciousness, community, consequence, and the endless human search for something transcendent in our ordinary lives. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers in the eternal hangover cycle that connects us all across time, culture, and the shared mystery of what it means to be human in a world where grapes ferment and consciousness can be altered and suffering teaches and community heals. And the conversation continues, night after night, hangover after hangover, generation after generation, in the gentle rhythm of seeking and finding and losing and learning that defines our species' relationship with the divine mysteries hidden in something as simple as wine.